Hi, I'm Lily. Today I'm going to be completing this sketchbook page with you while I talk about 5 mistakes I made as a first-year art teacher. Currently, I teach online art classes for homeschool students, mostly high school students, but I did start out teaching in middle school in the California public school system, and I feel like I had a lot to learn on the job. I definitely made a lot of mistakes, more than 5, but I thought it may be helpful for anyone out there becoming an art teacher to hear some of the lessons that I learned early on. They're hopefully all helpful, but I do think the 5th mistake is probably like the most. If I had to give one suggestion or tip to a person becoming an art teacher, this is probably what I would say. The first mistake I want to talk about is lending out art supplies to other teachers or staff on campus. So I doubt you'll go very long before you have teachers or teachers sending students to your room, asking to borrow paints, markers, poster board, anything like that. Now, of course, I want to support my fellow teachers, and if for some reason I had extra supplies or knew I wasn't going to be using something, I was happy to lend it out. But for the most part, after I did that a couple times, I tried to avoid it because what those other staff members usually don't understand if they haven't been an art teacher is that you have a set budget and you spend all that budget on supplies for the entire year, and then that's it. You don't have any more money, you can't buy more supplies, you're stuck with what you have. So if you feel totally fine lending something out, do it, but don't feel obligated in the slightest. I found that if I just explained kind of how it worked, that I have limited supplies and I just have to save them for my students and projects I have coming up, they always understood. On that note, if you're interested in seeing a video on what supplies you need to get your art classroom started, let me know in the comments below and I could definitely make a video on that. The second mistake I made was not creating a physical example of the project we were doing in class together. There's a couple reasons I found that you should really do this with every project. One, students like to see a physical representation of what they're going to be creating. And usually if I showed them like an actual physical example, this is what we're going to be making, they were much more interested and engaged, and it got them kind of excited. I would also always keep student examples from previous years to show. But obviously, as a first-year teacher, you don't have student examples, so creating your own will work just as well. Another reason to create an example is to test the project out to make sure it actually plays out how you're picturing in your head. There's been so many times I've thought, oh, I can do this project this certain way, and then as I'm creating it, I have to make little tweaks or changes to my plan or completely scrap it, which I've done before. This can also help you figure out what parts might be challenging to your students, where they might get stuck, and how you can support or scaffold their learning in that area. If you want tips on how to plan your art curriculum, I do have a video on how I organize and kind of plan it. I will link it somewhere on the screen. Once I figure out how to do that, it'll be linked here. One example of when I did not really practice something beforehand and did not plan it through is we were doing coil pots, like clay coil pots, and I didn't really want the students to get the tables all dirty. So I was like, oh, I'll just put wax paper down and then they can build on top of those. That was a horrible idea. I don't know why I thought that would work. I just was like, oh, that'll work. And I didn't even test it out. And the clay like stuck so bad to the wax paper, like it wouldn't stay on the table even if I taped it down. And just like that whole day was then chaotic because they were all like, it's not working, Mrs. Roberts. And I was like, I know, sorry. So I ended up figuring it out and we did something different the second day. But if I had just tested that out, I would have realized, oh, that doesn't work. So yeah, you always think things are going to go one way and they don't. All right, the third mistake I made was assuming my students knew anything. This sounds kind of funny, but I had an art teacher tell me this when I was doing my first observations before I became a teacher, but it's really true. You have no idea what knowledge the students have, especially in public school where you A lot of times you don't always know the art teachers they had previously, or if they even have taken an art class before. So you don't want to assume that they know primary colors. You don't want to assume that they know who Picasso is, or even that they know how to use a ruler. Obviously, if they do know it, great. You're just going to cover it and they'll get a refresher. Because otherwise, if they don't know it, I find it's very unlikely that they'll raise their hand in front of the whole class and be like, hey, Mrs. Roberts, I don't know the primary colors. Like, they probably will just sit there and not say anything, and you'll think that they know it. So I just always go over the most basic stuff, especially with vocabulary. There's a lot of art terms we throw around, like medium, value, tint, tone, master copy, all these things. And you should always cover these terms before you use them in your classroom. The fourth mistake is not placing all the supplies at the students' tables. This could be specific to my situation, but at the school I taught at previously, we could have up to 35 students in one class. When you have that many students, you want them to stay at their seats as much as possible. It also might depend on the age. I feel like middle and elementary, you usually want them to stay seated. Once they're up out of their seats, it can get really chaotic. But in general, if you give them any opportunity to be out of their seats, even getting up to sharpen their pencil, they can really take advantage of it. I would always have a bin in the middle of their table, and I also numbered their tables as well, with every supply they would need for that class period. If possible, I would also know how much of each item was in the bin, so I would know, like, okay, we have 4 pencils, 4 erasers, 4 Sharpies. And then as they were cleaning up at the end of the class, I would go around and check each bin and make sure they had all the supplies. You would be surprised how many supplies can magically walk out of your classroom, especially Sharpies. But even pencils and erasers, a lot of times the students aren't doing it on purpose. They just, put it in their backpack on accident or whatever. So then all of a sudden you realize you have no pencils anymore. This was a helpful way to kind of keep track of my supplies and also keep them from having to get up and grab supplies. They have everything they need at their table. The fifth mistake I made was not having a plan and procedure for everything. And I mean everything. If students need to wash their brushes, you should have a plan for that. Will you be dismissing them to the sink by table? Do they know how to wash their brushes? Have you covered that information? How are you going to make sure the brushes are actually clean? How are they going to dry? Things like that. Or another big one is, what are students going to do when they're finished with a project? You will not have all of your students finishing a project magically at the same time, although that would be great. One of the big issues in the art classroom is, what do you do with students when they finish early? Obviously, you can always have them keep improving on their artwork, but there might reach a point you have nothing else for them to add or change to it. So what are you going to have them do during that time? Also, before you start a project, know exactly how students will do each step, how they're going to get their supplies, how they'll clean up. I would just say in general, you should overplan, especially when you have a lot of students and a lot of bodies moving around a classroom. You really need a procedure for the smallest things. I remember one project I did, we were doing yarn weaving on cardboard looms. I only had so many spools and rolls of yarn. I couldn't really have them at each table. So the students had to get out of their seats to get the yarn. And that became a disaster so fast. Eventually, I did kind of come up with a system, but yeah, I was not prepared and it became really chaotic. And that's something small you don't necessarily think about, like, oh, they'll just grab the yarn, but how will they grab the yarn? So planning all of that is very helpful. I hope this was helpful for anyone early on in their teaching career, or just entertaining for someone even if they're not a teacher. I know I watched a lot of YouTube videos to try and prepare for becoming a teacher. There's not tons of art teacher content out there, obviously, because there's not tons of art teachers, but yeah, hopefully it was helpful. I hope you liked the spread as well. I used alcohol markers and colored pencils. I do like how it turned out overall. Mostly, I was happy with how the pairs came out. That actually turned out how I was picturing in my head, which I feel like is rare. But yeah, anyways, I'm planning on finishing the rest of this spread soon. So I will upload another video once it's all finished of the whole spread, unless it turns out hideous, and then I probably won't. But yeah, thanks so much for watching.